Good morning, Shannon.
Good morning. How are you?
So well, wonderful to be with you.
Yeah. Wonderful to be here as well. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. So in-house with Palaestra, where people grow together, or people and business grow together. And I just want to introduce our guest for everyone by reading your bio. Shannon Lee, of course, really needs no introduction. She's the CEO and owner of the Bruce Lee Family Companies and president of the Bruce Lee Foundation, and of course, daughter of the legendary martial artist and cultural icon, Bruce Lee. Shannon's mission is to provide access to her father's philosophy and life through education and entertainment. She's the creator of Camp Bruce Lee through the Bruce Lee Foundation and has spoken at TED, TEDx, and Creative Mornings. I loved your most recent TED Talk, by the way, which we can get into.
Right.
And she lives in California with her daughter, Ren, where she co-hosts the Bruce Lee podcast and is the executive producer for Cinemax's Warrior, which I have to say, Elizabeth and I have been working our way through, and it's a super badass show. So
Yeah.
congratulations for that. And
Thank
then
you. And I will say it's on HBO Max now also. So
HBO Max, that's exactly why we started getting into it. So we are HBO
yeah.
subscribers. So yeah,
Exactly.
really well produced, super cool kind of Western theme to the Kung Fu thing. So love to
Mhm.
hear a bit about that too. And with, of course, the book that was released last fall. Is that right?
Yes, October.
Yeah. So Be Water, my friend, the teachings of Bruce Lee. So
Mhm.
welcome, Shannon, again.
Thank you. Pleasure to be
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. So the book, by the way, congratulations for that. Um, it has like almost a 5-star rating with like 1,500 ratings. I think that's very hard to do. So
Yeah.
congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. And that, I mean, I'm surprised as anyone. That's it all. Every now and again, somebody will say to me, "Wow, you have so many ratings on Amazon and such great reviews." And I'm like, "Oh," because I don't typically check in with that kind of stuff. So I'm very pleased because this book is really it's my gift to the world. Like it's medicine that I find really helpful to me and my soul and my life, and something that I really wanted to share with the world at large. So I'm glad that people are picking it up and enjoying it and getting something from it.
Me too, so much. It was such a well-written book, and I couldn't agree more. It really feels like practical philosophy.
Yeah.
And man, what the world needs now with all the polarity is self-knowledge and self-actualization. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd share what is the origin story for that book? How did you decide to start writing it?
Yeah, well, I guess I should say I've always loved to write, although I never really thought about it as a career in any way. I just have always loved expressing myself through writing. Cut to a few years ago, we started the Bruce Lee podcast, which is an applied philosophy podcast where we talk about my father's philosophy and break it down, talk about how not only what it means, but how we can apply it in our own lives. And I prepped and researched all the episodes for the podcast, and gosh, at this point now we're up to 100 and something, or maybe even
Oh
close to
wow.
200 episodes. So it's a
Wow.
lot of episodes. So if you want even more Bruce Lee goodness, you can go to the Bruce Lee podcast. But and it was through that process of just really deeply familiarizing myself with the teachings, with the philosophies, with the lessons, and trying to integrate them into my own practice and my own life and self, which I had been doing on some level for many years, but not in such a direct and sort of methodical way.
Hmm.
Um, that that the notion of expressing this in another medium or another form started to take hold. And then actually, lo and behold, as sometimes the universe works this way, A literary agent reached out to me and said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book? I'm a huge fan of the podcast, and I'd love to represent you to try and get a book deal if you're interested in that." So it was just sort of like, the magic of manifestation
Hmm.
happening. And it was perfect, actually, because the timing was just right. Like, I was ready by then at that point. I think if someone had come to me 5 years earlier and said, "Do you want to write a book?" I think I would have said yes, because it is something that I've wanted, but I would have felt less ready to know what that book is and how to express it. And it would have been even more of a struggle than writing a book already is.
Right, right. Well,
Yeah.
I will tell you that it also was an editor's pick, which you may or may not
Uh,
know. And I
oh,
just want to read one of the reviews to get us in the neighborhood, and then we'll just go with the flow from there.
okay.
This one I thought was funny. It says, "Look, I'm sorry that you can't be Bruce Lee, but that's okay because you can become a better version of you the same way Bruce Lee did. And no one is better at walking down that path than his daughter, Shannon. Same clarity, vision, and life force that the world connected to when Bruce was on screen comes through Shannon."
Mm.
And then one of the reviews says, Bruce Lee philosophy for a new generation. So I just loved all of that.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
yeah, and one more technical question actually, which is how did you go about writing the book, given your father's work? I mean, it's prolific, not just martially, but off the mat as well, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I have to say, you ask an interesting question, because this has been the question of my existence in the Bruce Lee world. So I run, as you know, the Bruce Lee Family Companies and the Bruce Lee Foundation. And it took me, I've been doing that now for going on 21 years. And in the beginning, and I would say like the first decade, not just like the first year, it was a challenge to focus, because the philosophy is so applicable in a broad sense, and his legacy is so applicable in a broad sense, that when people say, "Oh, what you should do is this," or "Would you be interested in this?" or "What if we did a project about this?" You're like, "Yes, of course, yes," and then the next thing you know, you're trying to do 600 different things and you're not getting anything done.
Right.
So it's been a couple of decades of trying to really synthesize material into specific um, outlets, right? So
Yeah.
for this book in particular, the idea was to take arguably his most well-known philosophy, which is that of being like water, and attempt to express, what does that mean? Where does it come from? What does it mean? How is it applied? Um, and as you can see, one can write a whole book about that.
Exactly. Even that one concept.
Exactly. And one of the things I say in the book is, I touch lightly on many things that whole books have been written about also, such as mindfulness and different martial arts practices and meditation and um, um, the concept of emptiness, and these things that are big. They're really big, and so it was a challenge to attempt to say, well, this is how being like water relates to this, and to try to express that clearly without, like making this book be 6,000 pages long.
Right, right. Yeah, or some arcane text that is hard to
Well,
understand.
and I very much wanted this book to be um, for anyone. So if you have no familiarity with these concepts or philosophy or self-work or any of that, that you could still pick up this book and understand it and dive in. So my tendency has been to want to speak at the level that I'm at, which may or may not be, above or below the level of someone else. But this for me, it was like, I want to start it and try to speak as simply and clearly as possible. And of course, the concepts get a little bit more advanced as the book progresses, but
Mhm.
also to try to express those concepts in, again, in an evolution such that as you're reading the book, you start to go, oh, okay, I think I understand what this is, but leaves plenty of room for your own self exploration because, as we know, um, that's what everybody is it should be, not should be, but is the path, right? Like, you don't
That's the
really
path.
understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't understand it until you understand it, right? And not
Right.
just at an intellectual level.
Well, I literally mean it. The book couldn't be more timely for the world. It
Mm,
was the feeling I had as I listened through it. And you did such a good job of exactly translating these abstract principles into everyday reality. So
yeah.
congratulations for that. That's something I personally struggle with. So I think I admire it when I see it done well. I'm reminded, I think a year and a half ago or so, we connected through our mutual friend, Brian
Yeah.
Weinberg. And I had
Yeah.
the same experience of like, like looking at all of your father's philosophy and trying to like bring it together into connection with what I'm doing. And of
Yeah.
course, 80% of what I've been doing with Palaestra and the notion of martial arts as a metaphor and a dojo or a place you're going regularly to train,
Mm,
and self-actualization and self-development and practice, like so much of it was already present. So I definitely understood the challenge of trying to streamline and bring things to a point of or the simplicity on the other side of complexity, we'll say sometimes. So I think the book was very accessible in that way. And maybe that's a good segue to talk about the principles from the book as and also as a way of getting to know your father for people who are wondering why we're in a leadership podcast right now talking about Bruce Lee. But I
mhm.
can tell you, there's so much that's as relevant today as it was in the late 60s and 70s. Um, uh,
For sure.
so we're gonna get into that. Maybe the first, because most people will be thinking of him as, you know, a martial arts film star,
Mm.
just on a physical level as a martial artist, I think of him as a visionary or the grandfather of mixed martial arts. So what would you share about why were martial artists so in admiration of Bruce Lee?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons. I think what you say, which is that my father is known most widely for the films that he did a lot of times, and it took a number of years. I don't know that there's as much a debate now as there were in decades past about whether or not he was actually a martial artist or if he just did action in films. As we know, he was actually a martial artist. In
Oh
fact, he
yeah.
was he was a martial artist first and foremost. Acting was just a vehicle for communicating his art, essentially his martial arts, his culture, his philosophy. So and himself ultimately. Um, but I would say that as a martial artist, my father came up in the study of Wing Chun Kung Fu, which he learned in Hong Kong as a child. Starting at like age 13 until he left Hong Kong at age 18. And that's a very traditional form of Kung Fu. And as all of the arts have their specific traditions and moves and all of that, which is wonderful, by the way. But as my father progressed and started to have more experiences, he started to really, he was the kind of person who liked to um, learn. He was extremely curious and a learner, and he liked to experiment, primarily self experiment, right? So he loved martial arts and he loved the expression of martial arts through the body and the idea of combat. And because of that, he was constantly, in the beginning, he was drilling routine as you do when you come up through a particular art. And over time, as life intervened, he started to see there were limitations to his knowledge and limitations to his ability because of the rigidity of the routine.
Hmm.
And this is applicable to martial arts and applicable to life. Like anytime we have a specific methodology, it 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 um, it keeps outside of its boundaries other methodologies, right? And
Hmm.
so he started to say, well, if I want to just express myself with my arms and legs in combat to the absolute best of my ability in any situation against any kind of person, then I'm going to need to have more knowledge of myself and be able to move fluidly through these different states of that I find and circumstances in which I would find myself. And so the reason you call him, and so many people call him, the father of mixed martial arts, is because he started to break down those walls of tradition and those boundaries and start to look at the ways in which other people moved and other arts moved, including arts like fencing
Hmm.
and boxing, which a traditional martial artist wouldn't do. He also started to include fitness and cross training and weight training into his martial arts, which is something that martial artists back in those days traditionally wouldn't do, and started to really talk about having the style of no style, having a style that can morph given the circumstance and what you need to be able to accomplish and do. And of course, as we know, that expanded philosophically to um, not just the martial arts, but outside of the martial arts, to life in general,
Right,
right?
right.
Like, so, and so as a martial artist, I would say he's revered for a number of reasons because he was highly skilled. I mean, he was a martial artist at the top of his um, game, if you will. He
Hmm.
was exceedingly fast, exceedingly strong, um, and he practiced every day for hours. So he was, and so there was that component of it. You just look at him and you say, wow, he's really skilled. And if you were one of the people fortunate or unfortunate enough to actually exchange with him, you would go, wow, he, he was
Yeah.
exceedingly skilled.
Dragon snaps his tail. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But then there was also the innovation on top of it, which is that he started to say, which, as you can see, like culture sort of caught up to him. Like when the
Mm.
UFC first came out, it was a test of, can this style beat this style? And what they started to realize is, like, with especially once the Gracies came in with jujitsu and all of that, was that none of these stand-up martial artists had ground game. And
Right.
so immediately they were like, well, we can't defeat these people because if we get taken to the ground, we're in trouble. We have no knowledge of what to do in that situation. And that, of course, transformed into what we now today know as MMA. Well,
Hmm.
my father was already experimenting with that and talking about that and learning some ground techniques and things like that because he understood that this would happen if you got caught in that kind of a situation. And for him it was just pure, I mean, like when I say he was the biggest nerd of nerds when it came to martial arts, like he loved this, he loved it, like studying combat and learning from other people and, oh, show me how you do this, show me this, show me this, so that he could as I just pull my earphones out
Well,
of my in my excitement and enthusiasm.
we
Pull my
have to
headphones
adapt to
out.
that too. Yeah.
That's right. Whew. So there was that innovation as well, which of course in the beginning all innovation is met with resistance, especially if you're a practitioner of traditional style.
Right.
You say no, you can't do that. That's against the rules. You can't do that. That is not only is it against rules, it's offensive, right?
And there's some stories about that too in his history, aren't
Yeah.
there?
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, the sort of breaking point for him was that he was also, aside from starting uh, to do things outside of the bounds of tradition of practicing the arts, he was also going outside the bounds of teaching, which were that you weren't supposed to teach Chinese martial arts to non-Chinese. And he opened up his school to anyone and everyone, all walks of life, and women and people of all different ethnic backgrounds, and all of that, which also was sort of like, hey man, what are you
Yeah.
doing?
Yeah.
This, but
Like a religion is like he talks about the Chinese way, Japanese way, Korean way. It becomes like a gospel truth. It's like religion.
yeah, exactly. And he made that parallel often.
Yeah.
Um, and so he was challenged by the Chinese Kung Fu community in San Francisco, and like some, you know, thing out of a movie, there was a challenge match that was fought, and if he lost, he was going to have to quit teaching, and if he won, then he could go on teaching. And they brought their champion, and they showed up at my father's studio, and they had this showdown, and my father won, as I imagine we can all imagine that is what
Right.
happened given the course of the world. But the important thing is that even though he won, he saw the flaws in his performance. And in fact, he was extremely unhappy afterwards, because the fight had they had agreed at the onset that there wouldn't be any rules. Like, it was a no holds barred contest, and you either get knocked out or you tap out. And so when the match started, they exchanged a few blows, but the fight quickly devolved into running. The other guy started to run, he had to chase it, which is not what happens in a traditional match.
It's not what you see in the movies normally
Yeah,
either.
exactly. And so he realized that he was extremely winded, like, because he didn't have any cardio fitness at that point. And that his traditional regimen and arsenal of tools had not been helpful in that instance. And it was at that moment that he decided to break from tradition and say, okay, I'm going to die to what he called the classical mess and
Right.
be reborn into my own fluidity, into my own way of expressing myself martially and in life.
Beautiful. Oh man, I love all this stuff so much. And there's a very curious synchronicity that I lived in an Aikido dojo for almost 2 years
Mm,
as an Uchideshi. And I think that dojo in Oakland or south of Oakland in San Leandro was either where they met, like they kind of huddled before he went to do that fight, or there's some
mm,
connection to that whole situation.
wow.
So I remember hearing about that years and years ago, before I was really into Bruce Lee as such. And I just want to say the quote that's so famous that I think puts a point on what you just shared, which is he says, and this truly is the shift out of the traditional classical mess of fundamentalism of just repeating forms,
Mhm.
but never getting in the water to swim. He would call that dry land swimming, right?
Right.
And then the other one was truly a scientific mindset of
Mhm.
testing and experimenting and evolving and being willing to throw out the um, whatever is not functional. So that's what he said: absorb what is useful, discard what is useless, and add what is essentially your own.
Yeah.
Now, you hinted at this earlier that that's, of course, a metaphor for something off of the mat, too,
Yes.
in terms of self-actualization. So I wonder if you could tie that together for us a little bit, because last statement, such an evolutionary on the mat, just
Mhm.
in the sense of bringing that aliveness to martial arts and being willing to evolve what is functional, irrespective of different cultural traditions. There's just a universal truth. And under the heaven we are but one family. Is that the quote? So I
Yes.
think there's two things to comment on here. One is like what was happening with race
Mm,
and the stereotypes
mm,
that he was coming up against and challenging. And
mhm.
then the other one, of course, is Bruce wasn't just someone who was evolving the physical. I think you see that with MMA and
Yeah.
beautiful that it evolved physically, and then not everyone evolves themselves along
Right.
with their art. And you get the ones who are all art but not martial.
Yeah.
And for me, Aikido was that. It was definitely focused on spirituality and conflict resolution and self-actualization, but it didn't really do the work of evolving the form.
Yeah.
So maybe part one would be to say, what is the connection between that quote of absorbing what's useful and discarding
Mhm.
what's useless with the self-actualization process off the mat?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would say is with regard to that is we all as human beings are live in certain patterns of existence, things that we are familiar with, that we feel are proven um, methods that work. And that applies to everything. I
Like
mean,
our winning formula, sort of.
our winning formulas, exactly. Like it applies to how we may be in business. It applies to how we may be in personal relationships. It applies to how we may be just with ourselves even. And so one of the things that I think is why the path of self actualization and why this notion of like really the first line of that quote actually is research your own experience.
Really?
Yes. So
Uh-huh.
the first line is research your own experience, accept what is useful, deny what is useless, and add what is essentially your own, right? So
Uh-huh.
the first one is it's and actually that first bit of research your own experience is a call to sort of like wake up, become aware, to become conscious of what is it that you do. Right.
Yeah, what are we doing here? And it's like a call to, I'm hearing that as a call to mindfulness and
Yes.
presence, which is the essence of the scientific method anyway, observation.
Yes. Yes. And he would say that all the time. It's like, you want to know what patterns you're stuck in, observe yourself. And by the way, like we can look at this in all areas of life, like, oh, I typically tend to choose this kind of person for a partner, or like when I'm under stress, I respond this way, or when I'm challenged in a business meeting or in a personal relationship, this is my go-to reaction, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so this is applicable, and I want to say, for my book, that I do use martial arts analogies in the book because I find them to be extremely useful in because a fight is a challenge, and we are being challenged all the time on a personal level. Like we have challenging feelings come up, we have uncontrolled reactions that happen spontaneously, and all of that. And the idea as a martial artist, when we're talking about combat, is to train to be able in combative situations to respond in a way that is helpful, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That protects you and helps to move you forward also, right? So it's a great analogy, and my book, even though it has martial analogies in it, is not meant for only martial artists. It's meant for everyone. um, how to take those sort of things and apply them to everyday life, everyday situations. Like I find this person at my work to be extremely annoying, and I'm heavily annoyed every time I come into contact with this person. That's a pattern that you are in, or you have mental self-talk of, I beat myself up all the time. I think of myself this way, or not good enough in this
I'm
way.
not good enough. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm. I'm a
all of that.
popular one.
Very popular. I've been a part of that as well.
Me
So
too. Yeah.
and so the idea is to look at what patterns you're in, and to look at them without judgment. Because part of a pattern that we have is a pattern of judgment. This is
Hmm.
good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. And as long as you are putting that layer on it of good or bad or right or wrong, um, you're not really open to a wider range of solutions. You are saying, well, I can't do this, or I shouldn't do this, I'm supposed to do this, or I should do this. And it's like, well, you can't just bully yourself into into these solutions. You have to actually want to look deeply within and go, why am I doing this? Where does this come from? How do I shift it? What am I getting or actually not getting? Like, I think I'm protecting myself, but am I really? Am I really just shutting myself off from growing, from learning something about myself?
Right. That
And
that's reminding me of, sorry to interrupt, Carol
no.
Dweck's research on the growth mindset
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
the stuff she did, the research she did with kids. And it's exactly what you're saying. The only difference was, were they labeled for their character? You're smart, you're stupid. Even if they were just praised, oh, you're so smart.
Hmm.
And they weren't focused on the specific behavior, which had to do with the learning. And then they
Yeah.
became defensive and they were more likely to cheat on tests. They weren't willing to take on more challenges.
Right.
So just that one thing of like right, wrong, the general labels versus this worked, this didn't, what are you learning?
Right.
That was it. Being specific with the learning.
Right.
That sounds so much like what you're saying.
Exactly. No, exactly. You're exactly right. And one of the things I will say about my father, and I talk about this in the book, is that as diligently as he trained his body, which if any of you have seen his body, he trained it diligently.
Yeah, the cobra muscles, world famous.
And his physical, you know, martial skills and all of that, he also trained his mind just as diligently. So, as diligently to not just, like mental speed of mental perception or any of that kind of thing, but to really apply philosophy as to why am I doing this, am I in a pattern, what am I observing about myself, what more do I have to learn, what can I change, like all of these things. And again, without the layer of judgment, because if you are judging yourself like, oh, like, then you're putting a burden of um emotion on top of something that just is,
Mhm.
and that you can, and the change can also just be the change. This is the change I need to make, this is what I'm going to attempt to do to try to change it, and not like, oh, I'm a horrible person for having done this, or for behaving in this way,
Mhm.
and not that any of that is easy. It's not necessarily easy, but as you practice it as diligently as you may practice, you know martial arts, or going to the gym and doing your reps, like you
Mhm.
you can practice that as well. And over time it will change, but you have to have this awareness first. And I do want to say quickly that everybody needs to give themselves a break, because the draw to familiarity is very strong, very strong. What you've known your whole life, the way you've been your whole life up to this point is what you know. And so, of course, it's going to be easy to go there because it's what you're familiar with.
All right, that
And
keeps you safe.
familiarity, yeah, it keeps you safe. Even if it's a behavior that always has a bad outcome, you at least expect that. And when it happens, oh, there it happened again. Oh, well, you know what I mean? Like, but and that's familiar. It may not be
Mm.
pleasant, but it's familiar. And
Right.
the pull toward familiarity is very strong, very strong.
So true.
Yeah.
There's something in the research on developmental psychology, and your father intuits this in an uncanny way in his own stages of development, which maybe we can talk a bit about that, because that does tie right to the leadership development world. Um,
Hmm.
but basically, the notion that if you are the classical mess itself is where you're just socially defined. You're in the back seat of the car. You've adopted your parents or your church's values. You're not really self-authoring. You don't think for yourself.
Hmm.
You're a brick in the wall. There's a dozen metaphors we could use for this, but you're in the matrix. You're asleep in the matrix. Would be another one. And the
Yeah.
research that they've done on even managers and businesses is over half of adults are not developmentally adults. They're defined
Hmm.
by what other people think of them. And so they just go along with the same routines, with inherited thinking,
Yeah.
kind of in the rut of fixed patterns. And
Hmm.
they aren't really waking up and thinking for themselves or authoring their own story, maybe would be another way of saying that. And what I hear you saying, which I love, is this: just to look at physically how you train something, deliberate practice, like they talk about in the research on expert performance. It's like deliberate practice means 10,000, not 10,000 kicks one time. It means one kick 10,000 times. And
Hmm.
look in the mirror and get the feedback and illuminate your blind spots and pressure test and continuously improve.
Yeah.
And then off the mat, it's the exact same thing. We just don't think of it that way. Be your own
Right.
work of art. This is the art of living. Self-actualizing is creating yourself in your own
Yes.
image. And that
Yes.
takes, yeah, we joke that the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off, because awareness is painful sometimes. And it's
Yeah,
easier to just go along on
for
the short term.
sure. For sure, for in the short term. And I think that's the thing that needs to be stressed is if there are areas in your life where you are um unhappy or uncomfortable or stressed or dissatisfied in some way. Um, Typically, those are areas where we tend to have a short term solution for that. Like, I'm going to eat this food, or I'm going
Mhm.
to binge watch this show, or I'm going to shop, or I'm going to, whatever, right? Like, do this thing to assuage my sense of dissatisfaction and, at whatever level that may be. And again, and those are tools that work, but they only work for a moment. They don't work long term.
Right.
And so, but I want to stress it takes a lot of courage and a lot of diligence to 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 make a change. And that's not to say that a change can't happen quickly, because it
Mhm.
can, but it has to happen in a way where it's not just intellectually I understand if I change this my life will be better. It has to happen in a way that I have an experience at a deep level that of understanding, how this behavior is harming me, or an experience of understanding of what it's like not to have that behavior, even if it's just for a moment. Like, there can be these, sometimes they're called aha moments or
Mhm.
epiphanies, where you go, oh my gosh, like I just understood this on some deeper level. And now I need to sort of bring that understanding in and try to hold on to it and cultivate that, but understand that all of this takes a certain amount of courage, um, because the draw to the familiar is so strong, you know. And I just want to say all the time to people, like, you know, you go to the don't beat yourself up. You go to the gym, you can't walk into the gym and pick up 200 pounds of weight and just start, you got to build up to that point. And then at some point it becomes much easier, and it becomes you. It becomes a
Mhm.
part of you, becomes natural,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, what I hear there is the word embodied.
Yeah.
And I think in this culture, we're so analytical and intellectually focused. It's like enough to think we know. And there's no shortcut. Practice is the way. And it's, what is it, 10,000 hours to mastery, or even to remember a single thing. It's like 300 reps, I think, just to change one habit. And we don't
Mhm.
practice much. Some of my clients say, geez, that seems like a lot of coaching. And I'll say, have you done a marathon or a triathlon before? And they're like, yeah, I train 2 to 3 hours a day. It's like, well, if you're practicing once a month, no wonder that, it's
Yeah.
taking a long time. So are we willing to give as much to our inner work, as you called it earlier?
Yes.
And that's something you do, again, a
Yeah.
really nice job of in the book, is kind of giving the physical metaphors and examples of what it means to practice. And maybe it's a good segue to, how we gain self-knowledge. With your father talked so much about yin and yang, and what an amazing
Yeah.
symbol, just to talk about all of this. And I wonder if you'd go a bit through how you use that in the book as well, or
Yeah.
whatever's on your mind about that as I say that.
Yeah, well, it makes me think so my father created these plaques that were represented the stages of cultivation, and they were based off the yin yang symbol. And then the first plaque was, we all know what a yin yang symbol looks like. It has the two sort of teardrop shaped tabs with the dots on either side. But in the first plaque, he called it partiality, which
You
is
want me
the
to show
running.
this image? Actually, I have it here.
If you have it, yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
let's look at it. There it is.
Okay, great. So partiality down on the bottom is the running to extremes, right? The dots are not there. So in the yin yang symbol, those dots represent that you can never be fully in one state without it even still a little bit of the other state keep involved. But
And
in
of
this
course, they would
symbol,
be black and white normally. So it's literally in the yin yang. So it's literally like black and white thinking or something.
exactly.
Yeah.
And but here there's no dot. There's no like I have no balance of the other side of things, and the symbols are actually pulled apart. So this is like, to me, this is what you said, what you were talking about. I'm asleep in the matrix. I'm just in my extreme response to whatever emotion, whatever circumstance happens. I go into this unconscious reaction. I'm not balanced, I'm not present. I'm just running from one extreme to the other in my life, essentially. Like I'm either happy or I'm super sad, or I feel like I'm fine, or I feel like I'm an idiot and I'm worthless. So it's like it's so that's this first stage, and it's a really hard stage to be in because you're pushed and pulled in so many different directions, and you have no tools
Mhm.
essentially, um, or
I
you
think,
have. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, I think it's interesting you mentioned they're apart, which I
Yeah.
never noticed before. And that's also in developmental psychology, this stage of being socially defined tends that we means that we tend to go into black and white, which also means groupthink, which also means us versus them, like our one right way.
Yeah, and it's compartmentalization too. It's even within our own psyches. Like I compartmentalize. Like I have a way that I am over here and when I'm in this circumstance, and I have a way that I am when I'm over here in this circumstance, and those two things are not the same, and they don't come together even though they are states within me.
Right. That's very Jungian, actually, because now it makes me think of my persona is what I ought to be, which
Mhm,
is really only half of me. And then what I ought
mhm.
not to be is shadow. I push it into the unconscious, I repress it. So I'm
Yeah,
really only a caricature of myself. I'm nice or I'm
yeah,
tough, and I don't have access to the opposite.
right. Yeah. Yeah, and also in the way like I think of the traditional people pleaser, of which I have been one in my life at
Hmm.
various points, is the same. Like I show up for this person in this way, in this character, giving them everything that I think that they need and keeping what I need, to myself so that I will be liked, so that I will have love, so that I will da da da. And then for this person, I'm another way. And because this person wants this from me, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it, that's another way that I think everyone can relate to in some regard of how this partiality can be acting out, even within the wholeness of one's own persona and body, right?
Right. That's the story
Yeah.
about Socrates, where he would wrestle with people physically first before wrestling with them philosophically. Because what do you find out? You feel someone very quickly. Like you get to know
Right.
them quicker in 5 minutes of grappling than an hour of conversation. And it's exactly what
Mhm.
you're saying. Like, some people like to push people over and
Mhm.
they're all tough, all young, and other
Mhm.
people are the pushover.
Yeah.
And they don't know how to access their assertiveness. So it's like
Mm.
there's no dot, there's no balance, like you said.
Right.
And we're doing it in either case to win social approval, because that's how I ought to be
Yeah.
accepted.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. 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 And that's the research your own experience part, right? It's like, okay, I notice that I engage in this behavior. Why am I engaging in this behavior? What do I get from it? You know? And so in this phase of partiality, this is where, we want to start turning toward observing what's really going on in our lives, observing our inner states when I feel, you know, when I shrink and when I expand and all those different things, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the next stage is fluidity, the two halves of the whole. So this is the a full yin yang symbol. You've got the arrows representing perpetual movement, because as my father said, life is is always moving. It's perpetual movement.
Hmm.
Life lives, right? So when I'm engaged more fluidly in life, I am moving with life. I am, approaching every day as, something for me for a circumstance in which I can engage, right? Rather than just like, and so here in fluidity, you're engaged in some practice now, right? Like you've got some tools, you're paying attention, you're working on yourself, you're trying to have some balance and some fluidity in your being,
Hmm.
right?
It reminds
Um,
me of the just the word responsible says so much, because
mhm.
here we're more reactive unconsciously. And that's the kind of adolescent place too, because
Yes,
we're doing it to be accepted.
right.
Whereas the fluidity is the responsibility,
Hmm.
which also comes with that more self-authored mindset that comes from having practiced and examined oneself.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. And this phase, by the way, I know it's only the second plaque,
Mhm.
but this
It's,
is
yeah.
it's a very good notable place to be, so there's no there is a certain amount of, as you said, personal responsibility and consciousness and awareness and an attempt to be highly involved in my own existence and my own inner world, and how I would and the things that I would like to change and the things that I want for myself, and all of those types of things, right? And so this is a good place to be. As you said, I talk in the book a lot about the difference between reaction and response.
Mm-hmm.
Like a response has some discernment, it has some, cultivation, it has some um, um, attempt at considering for oneself what I would like the response to be before stepping into the response, or having worked on oneself enough that the response that I give naturally is the response that I would like, right?
You said the word consciousness before too, which I
Mhm.
think this symbol really speaks to as well, exactly with what you're saying, because now I'm not just being aggressive unconsciously as a defense mechanism. There's a little dot of the opposite in there that's
Right.
allowing me to remain balanced and choose to respond, but with assertiveness. But it's
Yeah.
not, I'm not getting, my amygdala isn't getting hijacked. So something else is flying the plane. Like, no,
Mhm.
I'm centered, as we'd say in martial arts, and choosing to assert
Mhm.
myself, or I'm conscious and I'm choosing to flow, which I guess we're
Mhm.
back to being like water as the
Mhm.
metaphor. I can
Mhm.
choose, it's
Yeah.
conscious, it doesn't have the energy that feels tight or reactive because I'm
Yeah.
consciously choosing my response, which is a very adult thing to do at the end of the day again.
Yes. Yes, it is. Yeah, no, exactly. And so then we come into the third form, which is emptiness, which is the formless form. And I think there are a lot of different ways to look at this in a practical sense, not necessarily in, like the Buddhist sense or something like that, although that comes into play here, obviously, as well. But I like to look at emptiness as Um, it's sort of the level of second nature. It's the level of a certain amount of spiritual consciousness. It's the level of oneness
Mm,
with all things. It's the level of what my father called the void. In my book, I talk about this notion of bridging the gap. How in martial arts, what you're attempting to do is bridge the gap between you and your opponent or you and your target. And if you can do that in the most quick, responsive, accurate, natural, appropriate way, then you are having more and more sort of success in what you're attempting to do. And and I think of emptiness in some ways as the place from which all response comes. And and it is the formless form. It is the
mm,
form of the universe, the form of, source, whatever you want to call it, from which all things are birthed.
mm,
And if you can have an awareness of your connectivity to all things, all people, all life, um, and on as a layer on top of, and I'm attempting to be successful and a good in my career and in my relationships, and I want this for my life and I want this for my life, you know which is great and wonderful, but if you can harness sort of the energy of source, of the thing that connects and binds us all, of the place from which all creativity springs, and start to engage your life in a with some spontaneity that is an absolute reflection of having cultivated your second nature, your higher self,
mm,
um, then then the whole world expands, the whole
mm.
universe expands. And
Beautiful.
this is
Yeah.
a more esoteric place to be, but it's a really wonderful place to sit with and contemplate with and be deeply with and to bring into yourself. It's sort of like you've done all this inner work in order to go this way, and now it's time to take all this and bring it in here.
Mm, beautiful. Yeah. For some reason, I'm now connecting to why he probably called it the Tao of Jeet Kune Do.
Yes.
It sounds very much like you're talking about the Tao.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, emptiness. There's so much in the Taoist literature about the use of the useless, and the hub of the wheel is what holds the whole wheel together. And in the
Right.
West, or at least in the modern West, we don't think of what the state beyond ego is, or that there is some kind of uh, higher power that can flow through us where the dance is dancing us, or the move is doing us, or the music's playing us. But that's the really beautiful flow state that is part of the reason we do martial arts in the first place, is my sense.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
wonder a question about, I think I asked you this before and I can't remember the answer, but the whole Dragon the Bruce Lee story in the early 90s, where he's, what's the actor's name again?
Jason
Uh,
Scott Lee.
Jason Scott Lee. The scene with the mirrors, they
Mm,
seem to implicate that Bruce had had a kind of witnessing or out of body, like a non-dual, an experience of non-dual consciousness. What is the story behind? Is there something factual about that?
well, I mean, that movie in particular, I is does use some Hollywood magic and metaphor to get the point across. But what I would say is my father spoke often about um, the metaphor of the mirror,
Hmm.
the reflective nature of the mirror, and he would say, you know, uh, uh, I don't have the quote right in front of me, but it's like respond like an echo, be still like a mirror. So it's like
Mm.
in the mirror, like I guess this is the way I would put it when it comes to um, the metaphor of a mirror is that yes, when I'm looking in an actual mirror, I'm seeing myself, and there's a whole bunch of metaphors I can say about that. But
Hmm.
what we want to get to is whatever I'm looking at with my eyes is a mirror,
Hmm.
so that everything is a reflection of me. And it's also a reflection of what I perceive. Like everything, how I perceive everything is a reflection of me. So how I think about this thing or how I feel about that thing is a reflection of me. And and so that is another way of researching my own experience, right?
That's
And
what the world needs now, let me tell you. I mean, I think that's part of what I meant. Like, if we're talking about self-knowledge, we're talking about
yeah,
projection and the mirror.
yeah,
And your book too had very concrete examples from your own experience about that I thought were really helpful to
yeah,
ground that.
thank you.
Like, why don't we know more about the unconscious and projection? And it's
Yeah.
simple as a mirror, really.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a great quote he has, which I don't have at my fingertips, but he says essentially like everywhere I go, I find myself. Everything I look at, I'm looking at through the lens of what I think, how I perceive it, how I feel about it, what I am, and so I am finding myself in everything that I experience. So if I'm looking at you, you're clearly not myself, but how I feel about you, how I engage with you is about me. Right?
And then we get into the hall of mirrors, because then my projection onto you is about me at the
Right,
same
exactly.
time, simultaneously.
Yeah. And I just want to quickly go back to, emptiness, the formless form. My father has this saying, and this is sort of the stages of cultivation, just to sort of tie that up, which is first I know nothing. I don't know how to do anything. I just am existing. Then I start really looking into my own experience and trying and developing tools and practice and figuring some things out and trying to be a better version of myself. And then I get to a place where, as my father put it, it hits all by itself.
Hmm.
I've done so much practice that now I can just be, and when I need to respond, I respond the way that I want to respond or that is most effective to respond because I've looked at all of this and I have focused my attention on the things that I want to change, such that when this situation arises, I just am. I just am. And in that moment, I'm creating myself.
Hmm.
I'm meeting every moment with the creation of myself, what I've worked on and practiced, and now the way I'm able to just be, right?
Beautiful. It reminds me of the very simple statement he has of stages of development, of going from no form, which would be like a child improvising on a piano, to
Mhm.
really going into the world of form and mastering the form, and then arriving again at no form. But it's a
Mhm.
much higher octave. It's what you're describing of being selfless and spontaneously meeting the moment with whatever's needed, and that being the
Yeah,
definition of mastery.
and the I, like the me, I disappears, right? That's where the ego can get out of the way, you
What a
know?
relief, huh?
Yeah.
Finally. But that's again what we're yearning for, is the selflessness, to be absorbed, to transcend ourselves in some way. And also in that sense, the founder of Aikido had the same thing. The goal of Aikido was, he called Take Musu Aiki, which Take
Mm,
is martial, but Musu is birthing, or that creativity,
mm, mm,
like to have mastered the form and then to forget it all. And
mhm,
so to be harmonizing with the moment spontaneously, which is beautiful.
mhm.
But I also, can I show? Go ahead, actually, if you have a comment on that.
Well, I was just gonna say, well, do I remember what I was gonna say? That's a good question. Um,
We're like
um,
water.
yes, exactly, exactly. And sometimes my mind is like water running through a sieve.
Me
Um,
too. Yeah. Keeps us
um,
present.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, and I guess I just want to always come back to, in all of this, like a certain amount of compassion for self in any of this process.
Mm,
Like I guess when I say, oh, you get to this place where the ego disappears and I disappear, and I think for a lot of people are like, but I don't want to disappear, and it's like, I just want to say, you actually don't disappear. It's like actually the essential you appears.
oh, yeah,
And so I think there's this, when things start to get a little esoteric or a little spiritual, people go like, but that doesn't sound good. That doesn't sound like something I want. And
right.
it's like, and that's fine. And what I would say is, don't worry about it. Just keep practicing. Just keep doing the steps that occur to you to do. And then as you gain momentum along, and as you walk down the path, at some point you'll come to a place where you suddenly understand what that is. And then you can see, like, oh, actually, I'm becoming more myself. I'm not losing anything. So,
Yeah, there's some paradox there of, I actually become more of myself when I self-actualize, and then I can, maybe people will relate to the concept of like servant leadership,
yeah.
or being the instrument for what's needed, being the instrument, like the breath comes through, but we're the instrument, we're of service to what's needed in the moment. um
Yeah. And I guess I would say, like, what would it feel like to you if you walked into a situation, you were absolutely 100% yourself, and somebody else didn't like it and had an emotional reaction to it, and you were like, okay, I'm still okay.
yeah, that is a revelation for most of us. Yeah,
you know,
like, yeah, who we think of as me is really the ego so often. Yeah, so what would it be like not to react, not to have that negative emotion, is what I'm hearing. One more slide if you're open to it, because this connects the whole.
go
When I first connected with you, and I was like, wait a minute, we used to use Jim Collins and the Good to Great book, which is like one of the most popular business books in history ever. It's like the
Mm,
business Bible. And he uses the yin yang. And
mm,
I wonder if we could look at it and have you comment on it. Because this introduces the concept of psychological development, or vertical development. We often talk about is like upgrading your operating system, getting to the next level, versus just learning more at the current level, like horizontally
mhm,
growing. And here it is, Jim Collins' 5 levels. And
Mhm.
you go from kind of how we were talking about it. Well, you're capable as an individual, but you're the one being given direction. And then maybe you're not even knowing how to relate to others that well, but to form a good team, that's the next level. And then learning to be the one who's adulting, so to speak, and responsible for outcomes and managing others to attain those outcomes, let alone kind of incorporating the internal side of it, vision and values and the development of people. But at level 5, so they studied about 1,400 companies from the outside in. And of those 1,400 companies, 11 they qualified as being great. And all 11, what differentiated them is they all had level 5 leaders
Mm.
leading them, or multiple level 5 leaders. And how did they define that? This is what he uses to define it:
Mm.
the paradoxical combination of, on the one hand, personal humility, and on the other hand, professional drive. And you can ask a room full of people, does anyone know the names of any of these CEOs? And no one knows their names because they weren't the out in front people.
Mhm.
And Jim Collins says that they're not time tellers, they're clock builders. They're not the
Mm.
charismatic leader types. So I wonder if we could use this to talk about, how do I get to the next level? How do I self-actualize in a way, and what does this paradoxical combination have to do with it, really?
Well, so one of the things that I talk about when talking about the yin yang symbol is that a lot of people tend to, in the West anyway, tend to think of the yin yang symbol as a symbol about opposites.
Mhm.
That, there's hot, cold, there's, drive, and there's humility, right? And actually, it's not about opposites, it's about complementary characteristics.
Mhm.
So if I'm talking about hot and cold, what I'm talking about in a wholeness is a range of temperature. So I'm talking about within the range of temperature, if I'm all the way down at this range, it's really hot. And if I'm all the way down at this range, it's really cold. And in between, it's a combination of the two. So we talk about it as a paradox, like, well, how can you be driven and humble at the same time? And it's like, well, because nobody is entirely one thing. And if you are, you're going to suffer the consequences of that extremism at some point. So, so my father spoke this way all the time. And if anybody's ever watched the Pierre Burton interview that he did in
Yeah,
1971,
I love that.
he's
Yeah.
talking he's talking and he's like he's talking about acting, and he's like, well, really it's about acting, unacting, and unacting acting. And it's like, the hell does that mean, right? And in that instance, it means I'm clearly acting, I'm playing a part, but I'm playing it in such a way that it doesn't appear that I'm acting, or I'm also not acting, because I'm literally present and responding in the moment. So it's like, how do you develop these things? It's like an awareness of self, an awareness of the fact that you have so much knowledge and also don't know everything, right? That you have many skills and not all the skills, right? Like, there are still some skills you may need to develop, that you are not always right. You are sometimes wrong, that you don't always have the answer. You might need to sometimes seek the answer. Like, this is the yin yang that we're talking about. And so to have this balance within yourself of saying, I have professional drive. I have a certain amount of clarity, a certain amount of vision, a certain amount of skill sets, but I don't have them all. I'm not perfect. I'm not. Um, I'm not infallible. I can have bad days. I can have stuff I haven't looked at in myself yet, which would cause me to react negatively or in a way that's not helpful, um, is where the other side comes in. You also have some humility. You also
Mm-hmm.
have some humanity, right, to yourself,
Mm,
where you say, I am. I, and I think this is sort of the thing that everyone struggles with in just human existence, which is, and it's playing out in such horrible ways in the world, is that people are struggling for significance and insignificance. It's like, on the one hand, I'm just one tiny grain of sand, but I'm also the entire beach. You know what I mean? Like, I
mm-hmm.
make up the entire beach. And it's like, we want acknowledgement, a lot of times in our life. I want to be acknowledged. I want to be seen. I want to be, which you should be 100%. And there's so much we don't see and we don't acknowledge. And so in ourselves, we have to have that drive and humility as well. Like, and so I think with, of course, I'm just spitballing here, but
Mm-hmm.
with the executive at that level, it's like they know what they know and they also know what they don't know.
That's the paradox, right? Gosh, I'm hearing so much that's like so profound psychologically, like back to Carl Jung. And the reason he calls the ego like a complex is because even that first stage of your father's model is the same thing. The adolescent state is where we are. It's like compensation is the word. I'm
Mm,
actually the unhealthy expression of both. I
mhm.
feel insecure and then I overcompensate by acting tough. And neither of them is authentic because they're not
Right,
integrated or balanced. And it's
right.
interesting with the level 5 leader, what it says basically after that in the book is we don't know how to create any. Like it's a black box. We don't know what's inside of that black box. But then you look at your father's stuff and it's like, no, it's right here. It's the same way you train martial arts.
Yeah, but I think the problem is that you have to create yourself. That's the issue. Like, you can give somebody all the tools in the universe and you can say, here's something to practice. I've found this works. I've da da da. And people can even find some things that are helpful, but it's wholly and 100% dependent on how far they're willing to go, how far they're willing to look at
Mm.
themselves. Some of
How
us,
do we create that in people? That capacity to self auth or self reflect, the self discipline maybe is another way of saying it.
I mean, I think that there are big shifts that need to happen. I think that that mental health, is something that should be, and by mental health, I even just mean, like, issues of self worth and self and acceptance and all of those things are things that should be taught right alongside math and English and all that sort of
Right.
stuff. You know what I mean? Like, if we can become a society that's more accepting and a society that's more conscious overall of the fact that we as human beings are all the product of our experiences and how we interpreted those experiences for ourselves, the environments we grew up in, the things we had access to or didn't have access to. And then, if you want to go on a spiritual, if you want to put a spiritual, bigger uh, point of view on this, we may also be the mix of our past lives and our
Mm.
ancestry and the big cosmic stew of all of that, if
Epigenetics or something too.
right, exactly, if that's part of something that you want to look at or willing to look into.
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so this is why compassion is so important,
Mm.
because and I think as a culture, we need lessons in compassion, and not in the, like, you need to be more compassionate kind of way, but just to have a understanding that not everybody has the same experience.
Mm.
Like, we have this because of our ego and our own experience. and our wounds and all of that, we have this sense. Like, I'll give you a perfect example, and I remember this so clearly. I was in the first grade,
Mm.
and we were filling out these like number charts. This was in the 70s, so you can imagine that they don't do this anymore, but we had to write in a box the numbers 1 to 100. So I'm sitting there, I'm like 1, 2, 3, 4. And there were kids who were struggling with this. And I was like, what don't you get about this? You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like,
Yeah,
this is easy. Like, I don't understand. And that is the pervasive attitude out there in the world. Why can't you see this, that this is true? Or why can't you see
right.
that this is my
My
experience?
way of seeing
Yeah,
it.
right. Exactly. And it's like, well, I can't because it's not my experience. And I may have all sorts of things. I may be dyslexic. I may have learning disabilities. I may have been, raised without, access to many things, and or without even just somebody who gave me love and who gave
Mhm.
me a comfort, like I may have had many different things going on within me that you don't know about. And so my experience is entirely different. And that's where compassion comes in.
Mhm. I really am appreciating that we've touched into that a few times now. And I think of your father as just what a force of nature and a hero. He really is, as you've said before, a live superhero action figure in some sense. And then I also hear you like providing the complementary perspective, and it's the feminine too, in some sense. It's compassion. So that's really beautiful
Yeah.
and so needed. Whatever the politics are, it's like we all stand to be a little more compassionate,
Yeah.
whatever side we're on. Um, and I wonder, maybe that's a good place to ask you about your favorite quote
Mm.
and what that has to do with all of this.
Yeah. So the quote that sort of opened the doors for me, because certainly I'd heard a lot of my father's quotes my whole life, being like water and using no way is way, and all these walk on, and all these different ones that are much more famous. But for me, I came across this quote of his that I had never seen, that I didn't know, at a time in my life when I was in a lot of pain, after my brother had been killed, and I really was suffering greatly because I didn't know how to deal with it, and I wasn't dealing with it. I was just in grief, and the grief would well up, and like whenever it could, and I just didn't have any perspective on how to feel better. And I had been given a giant thing of my father's writings, copies of my father's writings, and I was going through them, and I came across this quote that I had never heard before. And the minute I read it, it just turned a light on in me. And I don't, uh, you know, uh, it's not necessarily provided any answers, but it gave me hope. And
Hmm.
I think that when something gives you hope, then that is a clue to try and follow that thing, right? To try to bring more of that into your life. And so the quote that I came upon was, the medicine for my suffering I had within me from the very beginning, but I did not take it. My ailment came from within myself, but I did not observe it until this moment. And now I see that if I am to find the light, I must be, and now I see, I always mess this part up. And now I see that if I ever, in order to find the light, I must be like the candle and be my own fuel.
Wow, that is so deep on so many levels.
Yeah. And I have to say that in the process of my own self work and my own self discovery, it becomes clearer more and more with every passing year how whatever things I suffer, I am the cause of.
You're right. As my teacher Byron Katie would say, but only 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's not to say that if a building falls on me and crushes me, that I'm not suffering pain from
It
that.
still hurts. Yeah.
That is an external circumstance, right? But how I deal with it, how I move forward from that thing, how I perceive my life given those circumstances is all within my own purview.
hmm Well, how was that quote medicine for you in that moment when you found it?
I think I was just in so much suffering, and it felt it was unwieldy. I didn't I was like, well, how does one ever get over the death of a loved one? Like the circumstances never change. This person is always not here.
Yeah.
So I can't make myself feel better by changing that circumstance. That's never going to be the case. So I think so then I think that quote just said to me in that moment, yes, but you can change your internal circumstance. You can change your relationship with that. You can go on a path to seek. You're not the first person that's lost someone in the world. And by the way, you lost your father when you were a child, and my brother's death brought up a whole thing about that for me as well, where over time, as I did eventually find a way to heal and change my perspective on life,
hmm
period, um, I realized that I'd spent most of my life with a mild depression and in a sense of just sadness and grief that I didn't even know was really there, or I just thought, back to what we were talking before, was everyone's experience. Well, I feel this way, so everyone must feel this way.
Right.
You know, everyone must walk around with a certain amount of pain and depression.
Yeah.
Right?
And in some sense, that's true.
And
And in
right.
another sense, it's our story, our projection.
Well, and what you don't understand, and I think that this is why I encourage people to go on the journey, why I encourage people to try to be better is and the gardener just kicked up the lawnmower and
Yeah. Right on to, we're just about
right
done
on
in any
cue.
case. Yeah, right on
Um,
cue.
why I encourage people to go on this journey is because my experience has been that as I work on myself and attempt to be better, I feel better.
Yeah. I hear the quote as connecting to the supposed last words of the Buddha, where he said, "Be a light unto yourself."
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that um, we got to have this time. And I wonder, maybe as parting words, how does someone begin this journey? What would you say?
Um, I mean, here's the thing. I don't think I'm not encouraging people to like quit their job and go live in an ashram in India, like certainly that's one path. But what I would say is back to the quote, which is research your own experience. I would just really look at like, what are the patterns I find myself in? What are the things I wish were different or that I could change or that cause me some pain and even if I want to blame those things on other people, like, well, I wouldn't be this way if that person weren't such a jerk to me all the time. Um, that's a point of pain for you. And what I would say is look within yourself. Why is when this person speaks to me this way, why do I take that on? Why do I think that means anything about me? And why, or what does it mean? What am I making it mean about me? Right. And so these little self-inquiries can just be the beginning of really wanting to understand. We talk about self-knowledge, right?
Yeah,
Like really
right.
wanting to understand oneself. And it's pretty interesting when you start to follow the breadcrumbs where they lead. And all of a sudden you go like, oh my God, like this is from um, one or two things can happen. So you can follow those breadcrumbs all the way back to like some traumatic incident as a child where somebody spoke to you in a certain way and it made you believe something that you've held on to for your whole life, right?
Oh, right.
There's
That's it.
that. There's that. Or it can just lead to you going like, oh, you know what? I've been thinking about this. I can think about this in another way. Like sometimes that's all that you need is to go, oh, when I really start to apply some logic and have a little self compassion and understand that I don't understand everything and that I've been looking at it this way, and that maybe there's a different way to look at it that doesn't have so much emotional impact on me, you know, that can just suddenly like lighten the load a
Hmm.
little bit, you know. So when my father uses his core tenet, which is using no way as way, having no limitation as limitation, that's what he means by using no way as way. Get outside of the pattern. You have a pattern of thinking about something in a particular way. Find another way. Try on another way and see what that can open up for you.
That just grounded for me the concept of having the medicine within me, but it's bitter
Yeah.
and I don't want to take it because it's
Yeah.
the source of my pain sometimes. And then I'm projecting that outwards. I don't want to see in the mirror. And on the mat, it's like, I don't want to look at my blind spots. I just want to do what I'm good at instead of being broken down, even though the disruption can be the growth, of course.
Mhm.
So parting words, what are you up to next? Where can they find you if they want to follow your journey?
Yeah. I run the Bruce Lee family companies. So from a Bruce Lee perspective, there's brucelee.com. There's all the Bruce Lee social media that we do. There's the Bruce Lee podcast, which I'm the host of. Um, there's, projects that I do, such as Warrior. We talked about briefly at the beginning, which is on HBO
HBO
Max.
Max, everyone. Yeah.
um, I also I executive produce that series, and then I have my own Instagram, which is at the real Shannon Lee, and I'm actually right now working on my own dedicated website so that I will have um, a channel that's my soul voice and not the Bruce Lee voice, even though that the Bruce Lee voice is very much mixed with my voice.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, the book, Be Water, My Friend, and yeah,
That's it.
all those places.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I thank you so much, Shannon. I love talking shop in this
Yeah.
way. This is, I know so much about my purpose and our shared
Mhm.
purpose for the world. So I just hope that your father's knowledge and your own new website just find their way into the hands of everyone who is needing it. So thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you. It was wonderful chatting. I love just talking in this way. So thank you.
Yeah.